Beginning Chapter 5 of Surprise Kill Vanish by Annie Jacobson. The name of the chapter is Ruin and Rule in Guatemala. On the wild night of June 16th, 1954, a charismatic 26-year-old Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara stood staring out the window of an apartment in Guatemala City, listening to machine gun fire and watching a fighter bomber aircraft fire on civilians below. He sat down to pen a letter to his mother, a wealthy aristocrat whom he adored. He felt a rush, watching people die for a cause. He confided to her, even the light aircraft bombings have their grandeur. The sounds of its machine gun and the light machine guns that fired back at it leave me with the magic sensation of invulnerability. At the time, the young doctor had no idea that the jet fighter he observed was being flown by an American-trained mercenary pilot who was part of a covert action operation for the CIA. The moment transformed him, he later said, like an inciting incident, like an inciting incident in a Shakespearean tragedy. The attack on Guatemala City catalyzed Che Guevara into action. Many men dream of leading a revolution, but Che Guevara would actually do it. His actions put him directly in the crosshairs of 3 U.S. presidents, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. He would eventually be assassinated by CIA-trained fighters in the mountains of Bolivia in 1967. Che Guevara had come to Guatemala to study medicine amid social revolution. When he first arrived, the country was in the throes of civil unrest. Guatemala, located just south of Mexico in Central America, had been plagued by violence and social upheaval since 1944. When University professor Jose Arevalo became the country's first democratically elected president for the first time in its history, Guatemala got a constitution, an elected representative body, and a Supreme Court. But the violence was constant. President Arevalo survived 25 coup assassination attempts in his 6 years in office. From the perspective of the White House, political instability of this magnitude made Guatemala a prime target for Soviet meddling. And in 1950, the U.S. State Department sent its top diplomat, George Kennan, to investigate. After touring Latin America, Kennan took to the hardline view that Moscow was indeed making ominous inroads in the Western Hemisphere. Here, as elsewhere, Kennan wrote in a secret report for the Secretary of State. The inner core of the Soviet communist leadership is fanatical, disciplined, industrious, and armed with a series of organized techniques, which are obviously first-rate. In all likelihood, Kennan warned Moscow's first conquest in Latin America would be Guatemala, which it could then use as a beachhead to launch a takeover in the Americas. Kennan advised the Secretary of State that communist influence in the Western Hemisphere had to be curtailed at any cost. Diplomacy was unlikely to work, and military intervention was not plausible, he wrote, which left covert action as the third and best option. Now this gets us into dangerous and difficult waters, where we must proceed with utmost caution, advised the man who'd first proposed that the CIA develop a guerrilla warfare corps. What choice was there? From Albania to Poland, 7 governments in Eastern Europe were now being ruled by Stalinist leaders who'd been emplaced by rigged elections and who maintained power through a devious partnership with Moscow's iron-fisted state security services. Moscow's movement toward Latin America forecast only disaster. Keenan's report was reviewed by the President's National Security Council, whose members unanimously agreed covert action was the best way forward. The following year, in March 1951, a liberal Democrat named Jacob Arbenez, son of a Swiss-German father, and a Guatemalan mother, was elected president. In his inaugural address, Arbenez promised to move Guatemala from a backward country with a predominantly feudal economy into a modern capitalist state. The way he intended to do this, he said, was by limiting influence by foreign corporations. Guatemala was a poor nation with an agrarian-based economy. 2% of the population owned 72% of the land. The largest landowner, also one of the country's largest employers, was the American-owned United Fruit Company, a banana farming concern. When President Arbanez instituted sweeping reforms in farm labor and called for the expropriation and redistribution of land, including 234,000 acres owned by United Fruit, President Truman's National Security Council took the position that these anti-American moves were being engineered by Moscow. The time had come for the hidden hand of the United States to intervene. It is essential to our security that we fight fire with fire, Keenan observed. President Truman created a powerful new advisory committee to determine the desirability and feasibility of covert action operations, called the Psychological Strategy Board, PSB. It included the Director of Central Intelligence, the Undersecretary of State, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, with a representative of the Joint Chiefs of Staff acting as principal military advisor. The informal structure of the Psychological Strategy Board allowed for problem solving to occur outside the scope of normal bureaucratic channels, insulating the president from potential backlash through plausible deniability. The working group should shy away from any thoughts of a charter which would require formal departmental concurrence, suggested Frank Wisner, then CIA Deputy Director of Plans, in an early staff meeting. An agreement was reached to develop a paper which would be informally accepted by the board as indicating the general lines which we would probably follow. In the case of Wisner, who was simultaneously in charge of JAC operations in Korea, the construct of plausible deniability insulated him personally from consequences, as the historical record makes clear. Whether Wisner was aware of his outsized incompetence during this fateful time, willfully ignorant of it, or mentally ill, remains the subject of debate. What is clear is that the goal of the psychological of the PSB, Psychological Strategy Board, was not only to devise and plan covert operations, but to manipulate the public's perception of these hidden hand events. Our job is to influence the minds and wills of other people. Board members agreed, not as in word warfare, but through paramilitary actions that had real world consequences. We help shape events to include all elements of pressure and persuasion. The Psychological Strategy Board Director, Gordon Gray, told the president. The Psychological Strategy Board's plans for Guatemala was to stage a coup d'etat against President Arbenez and overthrow him, using a CIA-trained guerrilla fighting force. The Office of Policy Coordination was in charge, as in Korea. The man chosen by the CIA to lead the mutiny and be installed as Guatemala's new pro-American president was a former Guatemala military officer living in exile in Honduras, Carlos Castillo Armas. He was corrupt, right-wing, and militaristic, but the Office of Policy Coordination was willing to work with him because he had a decent-sized guerrilla force loyal to him, fighters who could be trained and equipped by CIA paramilitary officers with relative ease. In January 1952, CIA headquarters began drafting its first known assassination list, a compilation of individuals to eliminate immediately under the agency's Title 50 Covert Action Authority. This list was followed by at least 2 additional kill lists, one titled Guatemalan Communist Personnel to be disposed of during military operations of Calergis, the code name for Carlos Castillo Armas, and the other under the heading Selection of Individuals for Disposal by Junta Group. The targets or deposees would be neutralized under a construct called executive action. This euphemism, adopted by numerous future U.S. presidents, remains in effect as of 2019 and of today. Whether President Truman was made aware of the assassination campaign remains a mystery. But the very next month, the subject of Soviet assassination capabilities was discussed by Gordon Gray in a top-secret report to the president. Throughout the world, Gray wrote, the Kremlin has built up networks of agents who would move at the word of command to carry out an assassination or foment a civil war. A subtle suggestion that the Psychological Strategy Board plans for assassination were but a necessary means of fighting fire with fire. Assembling a list of individuals for assassination was a flawed and haphazard process. CIA officers first worked from a 1949 Guatemalan Army list of communists, augmented by information from the Directorate of Intelligence as it came in. Memos made public in 1997 show that the list included top-flight communists whom the new government would desire to eliminate immediately in the event of a successful anti-communist coup, but quickly grew to include other Guatemalans. Clandestine service officers were queried to help decide who else should be included on a final list of deposees, with one employee assigned the job to quality control to verify the list and recommend any additions or deletions. The assassination list was sent to Carlos Castillo Armas for input. The illegitimate son of a farmer, Armas had spent much of his life engaged in guerrilla warfare. From 1948 to 1949, he'd served as the director of Guatemala's military academy. By 1952, he'd been involved in 2 previous coups d'etats in Guatemala. He was a wanted man in his own country, and his list of enemies was long. In September 1952, Armas added as many as 58 names to the CIA's assassination list. Things quickly got more complicated. That same month, in the Dominican Republic, the strongman Generalissimo Rafael Trujillo, called the cruelest dictator in the Americas, got word of the CIA's assassination list and wanted in. Trujillo made a deal with Carlos Castillo Armas in exchange for the killing of 4 Santo Dominicans, at present residing in Guatemala. He offered Armas his material support. Castillo Armas readily agreed, says CIA staff historian Gerald Haynes. In addition to requesting that certain of his enemies be targeted and killed by the CIA, Trujillo offered to send his own assassins to participate in the action. Special assassination squads that were already trained. In a declassified agency memorandum, these death squads were referred to as Trujillo's Trained Pistoleros, and as K, presumably for kill groups. But after considerable debate, says Haynes, the idea was vetoed by the State Department. Still, Armas continued to make side deals of his own, and the CIA learned that Armas intended to make maximum use of the K groups and would dispatch Nicaraguan, Honduran, and Salvadorian soldiers in civilian clothes to infiltrate Guatemala and assassinate unarmed communist leaders loyal to Armas. In Guatemala City, a local asset provided his CIA handler with a hit list with the location of the homes and offices of all the targets that had already been drawn up. Haynes says records of what happened next were destroyed or lost. The CIA did not create the Latin American propensity for assassination. Long before the Central Intelligence Agency existed, targeted killing was a well-established political tool throughout the region. These were the rules of the game for authoritarian regimes that ruled by force and corruption, not laws. In 1949, the President Arbanas himself had benefited from the assassination of his political rival, Francisco Javier Arana. Arbenez had been one of only 6 men present with Aran when Aran, chief of the country's armed forces, was shot in broad daylight during an altercation on the Puente de la Gloria outside Guatemala City. As president, Arbenez did little to solve the extrajudicial killing he'd personally witnessed. There was no investigation of the murder, and his rival's assassins were never apprehended. As of 2019, the killing remains a mystery. As the CIA worked on its paramilitary operations and assassination plans, the President's Psychological Strategy Board oversaw a robust psychological warfare campaign intended to influence the minds and wills of the people, to wage a nerve war against individuals according to a declassified memo. The idea was to instill fear and paranoia in a core group of military officials close to Arbenes, so they might become turncoats and participate in a mass defection of the Guatemalan army. As plans moved forward, the U.S. presidency changed hands. In January 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States, and the Psychological Strategy Board briefed the new Commander-in-Chief on its covert action operations. Cold War concerns convinced President Eisenhower to order the removal of the democratically elected leader by force, according to Haynes. Starting on April 13, 1953, top Guatemalan communists received death notice cards, some for many as 30 consecutive days, the contents of which remained classified. Others received physical objects courtesy of the CIA, including small wooden coffins, hangman's nooses, and toy bombs. Communist leaders came home from work or woke up in the morning to find graffiti painted on the exterior walls of their homes. "Here lives a spy," one message read. Another threatened, "You have only 5 days." The operation was gaining momentum. Declassified documents illustrated how quickly CIA officials at the highest level got on board, with more advanced assassination or liquidation plans. J.C. King, CIA chief of the Western Hemisphere Division, learned of the hit list and on August 28, 1953 suggested possibly assassinating key Guatemalan military officers if they refused to convert to the rebel cause. The following month, King sent a memo to CIA Director Allen Dulles, stating his support for neutralizing President Arbenes. To the CIA, assassination was an objective, an action to be carried out with the precision and detachment of a military operation. It was during this period that the CIA assembled its first known how-to instruction booklet on assassination as an instrument of foreign policy, as a political tool. An extreme measure not normally used in clandestine operations, titled A Study of Assassination. The manual was organized into sections including planning, techniques, and classifications. The ideal assassin worked alone, always mindful of the fact that no assassination instructions should ever be written or recorded. He or she would almost always report to just one person, with this same individual overseeing their infiltration to and exfiltration from the targeted area. In addition to having all the qualities of a clandestine service agent, an assassin would have to be determined, courageous, intelligent, resourceful, and physically active. Knowledge of a variety of weapons, including knives, firearms, grenades, and small bombs, was imperative for success. It is possible to kill a man with the bare hands, but very few are skilled enough to do it well, the CIA posited. A human being may be killed in many ways, but sureness is often overlooked by those who may be emotionally unstrung by the seriousness of the act they intend to commit. In a section entitled Justification, the CIA warned its would-be assassins of the dark psychological territory into which they were heading. Murder is not morally justifiable, and assassination can seldom be employed with a clear conscience. Persons who are morally squeamish should not attempt it. The unvarnished truth about assassination was that while some operations involved the objective detachment of a sniper rifle, a pistol, or a lethal dose of poison, an assassin must always be ready to kill his target mano a mano. For that, he had to be willing to make use of any real-world object that might be lying around. Anything hard or heavy will suffice, counseled the CIA. A hammer or axe, fire poker or lampstand, pushing a target off a bridge, down an elevator shaft, or out an open window was just a wise course of action. The assassination could play a horrified witness if questioned by police. Staged car accidents were not recommended because a lengthy investigation almost always ensued. But if an assassin could drug his target and push the man and his vehicle off a high point or into deep water, that tactic could be considered. If the target was an alcoholic, getting the man drunk or injecting him with a lethal dose of morphine before he passed out was always a viable option. Always avoid explosives and demolition charges, assassins were told. They were unreliable and prone to accidents. Often, when used as a booby trap with a time delay, these kinds of devices wound up killing the wrong man. Most of all, the assassin had to accept that he was not judge, jury, or hangman. Assassination of a person's responsible for atrocities or reprisals may be regarded as just punishment. The authors forewarned, but to think of it as retribution for an offense was not what covert action was about. To kill a specific individual under Title 50 authority of the U.S. Code was about prevention, not revenge. Killing a political leader whose burgeoning career is a clear and present danger to the cause of freedom may be held necessary, the authors of the CIA's assassination manual made clear. On September 11, 1953, the CIA submitted its General Plan of Action for Guatemala, codenamed Operation Success, PB Success. President Eisenhower signed off on the operation, approving a $2.7 million budget for psychological warfare and political action, as well as subversion, to be conducted by the CIA. On December 23, 1953, the CIA's Office Policy Coordination opened a classified forward operating base in Miami, Florida, where covert operations in Guatemala would turn. Where covert operations in Guatemala would be run. All elements of covert actions had code names, people, places, operations, and locations. The PB Success Headquarters building, codenamed Lincoln, was located about 10 miles from Miami on the second floor of a shabby two-story structure in the corner of Opa Loca Airport, only ever to be referred as Building 67. Effective this date, all addressee stations will constitute component elements of PB Success Regional Command with project headquarters at Lincoln under Jerome Dunbar, Alan Dulles wrote. Jerome Dunbar was the code name for retired Colonel Albert Haney, former CIA station chief and CO. It was Haney, Frank Wisner, and Haynes Toft who had run the ill-fated Jack missions in Korea. The CIA reached an agreement with rebel groups in Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador to train and equip its guerrilla fighting forces inside these neighboring countries' borders. In these secret paramilitary training camps, deep in the jungle, the CIA trained and armed local commandos to act as the fighting brigade for Castillo Armas. Come come D, come D-Day, this paramilitary army of foreign fighters would make an amphibious beach landing to carry out the CIA's coup d'etat. In the style of the Normandy invasion, declassified documents reveal that at least 1,725 foreign fighters were trained by the CIA, with another 2,500 persons of lesser caliber and faith committed to joining fighting force if called upon. On January 5, 1954, Albert Haney requested a final list on the liquidation of personnel. The following week, Lincoln requisitioned 20 suppressors for 20 .22 caliber rifles, which were sent from CIA headquarters. A small group of key leaders were then chosen for the assassination program. On January 13th, cables were sent discussing training protocols for these assassination specialists. On April 17th, 1954, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, the CIA director's brother, gave PB Success the full green light. The following month, perhaps sensing his end was near, President Arbaz offered to meet with President Eisenhower to reduce tensions between the two countries. But it was too late. The CIA's coup d'etat was in motion. On June 15, 1954, CIA-trained sabotage teams and invasion forces launched from Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and moved quickly into staging areas just outside the Guatemalan border. At 5 p.m. on June 18th, President Arbenez held a massive rally at the railroad station. The gathering was buzzed by CIA planes. At dusk, Castillo Armas crossed the border with his personnel strike force. Overhead, CIA planes strafed Army troop trains. In Washington, D.C., the PSP ordered the Matamoros fortress in downtown Guatemala City bombed. 100 miles east of the capital, the city of Chiquicumula fell to CIA guerrilla forces as an American F-47 flown by a mercenary pilot dropped bombs. Finally, on June 27, 1954, as Castillo Armas attacked the city of Zacapa, President Arbenez capitulated and resigned. By June 30th, the CIA decided that the coup had been a success. Now it was time for the hidden hand of the CIA to vanish. Frank Wisner sent a cable entitled Shift of Gears, urging all CIA officers and operators to withdraw. On July 4th, the CIA dispatched a recovery team to Guatemala City to collect 150,000 documents related to all communist activity for future use. On July 12th, the Lincoln office in Opa-locka was shuttered. Frank Wisner ordered Albert Haney to destroy all documents relating to Operation Success. A few survived. The president asked the CIA to brief him on the operations. Allen Dulles, Frank Wisner, and J.C. King used maps and charts to narrate how the coup had unfolded. The president asked how many men had died. Only one. A briefer lied. Eisenhower shook his head. Incredible, he said. Indeed, it had been incredible, writes CIA historian Nick Collather. According to the agency's own records, at least 48 rebel fighters were killed in the action. The CIA's perpetuation of the falsehood that it had been a success gave way to a decades-long CIA myth that the Guatemala operation had been an unblemished triumph. It was often cited as a model, a means of encouraging future presidents to authorize similar covert action operations around the world. On September 1st, 1954, Castillo Armas declared himself the new president of Guatemala. Shortly after he took power, a group of junior Army cadets, unhappy with the Army's capitulation, staged a coup. It was quickly put down, leaving 29 dead and another 29 wounded. Come October, so-called elections were held, but Castillo Armas was the only candidate, and his government was being installed. A second insurgency emerged. This new military junta came down hard on the resistance movement, quashing rebellion with murder and opposition. It left tens of thousands, some historians say as many as 200,000 killed, tortured, maimed, or missing. 3 years later, on July 26, 1957, Armas, the CIA's puppet dictator, was shot in the presidential palace by a member of his own guard. He died instantly. The assassin, Romeo Vasquez Sanchez, fled to another room in the palace and committed suicide. The facts of the CIA's hidden hand operations in Guatemala would remain secret until May of 1997, when the agency's history staff rediscovered the allegedly lost records. Congress had been looking for them since at least 1975, when the Senate began its investigation into U.S. government-sanctioned assassination. 4 years later, in 1979, a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit ordered the Guatemala documents be declassified, but the CIA was able to keep its records sealed on national security grounds. As for the assassination program and kill lists, CIA staff historians continue to insist that no one was actually assassinated. This is a doubtful claim. When the documents were finally declassified, the name of the people targeted for the assassination was redacted, making it impossible to discern if any were killed before, during, or after the coup. Extreme secrecy and illicit hiding are but two elements of plausible deniability, designed to keep the office of the president from being embroiled in controversy and disgrace. But there is so much more that results, including grave and unintended consequences that the CIA can neither foresee nor control. In its hidden hand operations in Guatemala in 1954, the CIA created a revenge-seeking monster intent on destroying its creator. It took the form of Che Guevara, the young doctor who watched the CIA-led coup through an open window in an apartment in Guatemala City. Shortly after, he wrote the letter to his mother expressing the magical sensation he felt watching violence and revolution unfold. Che Guevara set out into the city streets to organize a resistance movement against plotters of the coup. He teamed up with an army militia and organized the communist youth and expressed a desire to fight. Instead of the group's leaders, assigned to him hospital duty and instructed him to await further orders. Within a few days, martial law was declared across Guatemala and the Communist Party was disbanded. With its fighters being rounded up, Che Guevara sought refuge in the Argentine embassy. There he learned that the heart of the Latin American communist movement was moving to Mexico City. He applied for a visa and made his way. It was there he met a young Cuban-born revolutionary living in exile there, Fidel Castro. He is a young man, intelligent, very sure of himself, and of extraordinary audacity. Che Guevara wrote in his diary, "I think there is mutual sympathy between us, Fidel Castro asked Che Guevara to join his guerrilla movement and serve as the rebel group's official doctor. And he accepted on the spot. In just 5 years, the two revolutionaries would transform complete unknowns to two of the highest ranking enemies of the United States." Back in Guatemala, as the CIA's cleanup group was sorting through files of the fallen Arbenes regime, CIA officer David Attili Phillips came across a single sheet of paper about the young doctor named Che Guevara and his communist ties. "Should we start a file on this one?" Phillips' assistant asked his boss. "Yes, I guess we better have a file on him," Phillips replied. Soon the CIA would place Che Guevara on their kill list. And that's it for today.